Alien husband gifted his wife to a human miner because she couldn't get pregnant, but then
The mining colony was a dusty, forgotten patch of land on the edge of human-controlled space. Days blurred together for the workers, their lives measured in tons of or pulled from the planet's crust. But everything stopped the day Voker's ship arrived. It wasn't just any ship. It was a behemoth, its surface a jagged mass of dark metal that seemed to absorb the sunlight. The miners shielded their eyes as it descended, its engines roaring like an approaching storm. When the landing struts crushed the earth beneath them, a heavy silence fell over the camp. Daniel, the colony's foreman, stepped forward reluctantly. He was a broad-shouldered man with weathered hands and a permanent scowl, the kind of man who had seen enough of the galaxy to know that when an alien ship this size landed, it wasn't for a friendly chat. The ramp lowered with a sharp hiss, releasing a blast of cold, artificial air. Voker emerged, a towering figure of muscle and menace. His spiked armor clinked with every step, and his glowing yellow eyes scanned the crowd with contempt. Behind him, barely noticeable at first, was a woman. Daniel's stomach tightened when he saw her. She was unlike anything he'd seen before, slim but strong-looking, with purplish skin that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Her glowing white eyes seemed to dart between the miners, and though she was silent, her posture was rigid, as if preparing for the worst. Chains bound her wrists, their metallic clangs underscoring Voker's heavy steps. Voker stopped a few feet from Daniel, towering over him by nearly a foot. "Daniel, isn't it?" he said, his voice sharp and condescending. "I have a proposition for you." Daniel crossed his arms, trying to mask his unease. "Let's hear it." Voker smirked, revealing jagged teeth. "I've grown tired of her." He gestured dismissively at the woman behind him. "She's barren, useless, a disappointment in every sense of the word. So, I'm giving her to you. A gift." The miners murmured in confusion, their whispers carrying the same question that burned in Daniel's mind. Why would a powerful alien like Voker give away someone especially like this? Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't trade in people." Voker chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Oh, don't be dramatic. She's no more a person than one of your mining tools. You could do with her what you like. Keep her, send her to work, or let her die out here, for all I care." The woman flinched at his words, her gaze dropping to the ground. Daniel caught the movement, and something about her silence made his chest ache. She hadn't spoken a word, but her fear was palpable. "What's the catch?" Daniel asked, his voice gruff. "No catch," Voker said with a shrug. "Consider it a favor, a token of goodwill. Humans like those, don't they?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't trust Voker. No one with half a brain did, but the way the woman's eyes flickered with a mix of desperation and hopelessness hit something deep in him. She was terrified, not of him, but of whatever fate awaited her if he refused. He sighed. "Fine, she stays. But this doesn't mean I owe you anything." Voker grinned, as if he'd won a game only he understood. "Of course not. Enjoy your little gift." He turned sharply, the chains around the woman's wrists clinking as he motioned for her to follow. When she hesitated, he barked a command in his guttural language, and she stumbled forward, her chains rattling until they hit the dirt at Daniel's feet. The moment was over as quickly as it began. Voker marched back to his ship, and with a deafening roar, it ascended into the sky, leaving the camp in stunned silence. Daniel looked down at the woman. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her hands trembling ever so slightly. He crouched to her level, his tone softer now. "Do you have a name?" She didn't respond. "Okay," he said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "Let's get you out of those chains and figure things out." As he helped her to her feet, he felt the weight of what he'd just agreed to. This wasn't just another tool to add to the camp. This was a person, and from the look in her eyes, someone who had been through hell. He didn't know what her story was, but something told him it wasn't over yet. The next morning, the camp was buzzing with whispers about the alien woman. Lyanna, as Daniel learned her name, stayed inside the small shed he'd cleared out for her. It was simple, a cot, a chair, and a table, but it was hers. She didn't venture out, and the miners gave the shed a wide berth. unsure of what to make of her. Daniel had dealt with aliens before, usually during tense negotiations over mining rights or supply shipments. But Lina was different. She wasn't here to trade or bargain. She was here because Voker had discarded her like a broken tool. That thought sat uneasily in his mind as he approached her door, a bowl of stew in his hands. He rapped his knuckles lightly against the frame. "Lina," he called, "I brought you something to eat." There was no answer, but the faint sound of movement inside told him she was there. He sighed and pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. She was seated on the cot, her back pressed against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. Her luminous eyes tracked his every move, wary but calm. He placed the bowl on the table and backed away, giving her space. "It's not fancy, but it's hot. You should eat." She didn't move, her gaze flicking from the bowl to him. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "Why? Why what?" Daniel asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice carried a sharp edge of suspicion, though it cracked slightly at the end. "You could have left me out there." Like him, Daniel scratched the back of his neck, searching for the right words. "I guess I don't see people as things to throw away. What Voker did, that's not how we do things here." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she uncurled slightly, reaching for the bowl. "I'll eat," she said quietly, "but don't expect me to trust you." "Fair enough," Daniel replied. "But you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Lina didn't respond, but the way her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly told him she'd heard him. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Daniel brought her food, and she accepted it with quiet caution. He tried to engage her in conversation, but her answers were short, and her eyes always seemed to linger on the door, as if she was waiting for someone to burst through and drag her away. It wasn't until the end of the week that she stepped outside. Daniel was repairing a broken drilling machine when he saw her emerge, shielding her eyes from the harsh sun. She moved cautiously, her gaze sweeping the camp as if mapping out escape routes. The miners stopped what they were doing, their tools hanging loosely in their hands. Daniel waved a hand in the air, snapping them out of their trance. "Back to work," he barked, his voice carrying authority. The men returned to their tasks, though he caught them sneaking glances at her now and then. She wandered over to him, her bare feet kicking up dust. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "Fixing this thing," Daniel said, nodding at the drill. "It's jammed again, probably from all the quartz we pulled yesterday." Lina crouched next to him, her movements graceful but hesitant. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the tool he was holding. Daniel blinked in surprise, but handed it over. "Sure. Knock yourself out." To his amazement, she quickly disassembled the drill's jammed components with a precision that suggested years of practice. She inspected the parts, muttering softly to herself in a language he didn't understand, before reassembling it in record time. When she handed it back, the drill whirred to life without a hitch. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Impressive. Where'd you learn that?" Lina shrugged, brushing her hands against her skirt. "Voker made me fix things. If I didn't, I'd—" She trailed off, her jaw tightening. "I just learned." "Well, you're better at it than most of my crew," Daniel said, trying to lighten the mood. "We could use someone like you around here." Lina glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "Why would you want me to help you? What do you get out of it?" Daniel met her gaze evenly. "I'm not Voker. I don't need to get something out of it. But it looks like you're good at this, and I figure you deserve to do something that makes you feel useful. If you want." She studied him again, her expression softer now. "Maybe," she said quietly, before turning and walking back to the shed. Over the next few weeks, Lina began to venture out more often. She helped in small ways, repairing equipment, organizing tools, even assisting in the kitchens. The miners were wary at first, unsure of how to interact with her, but Daniel's firm leadership set the tone. If he treated her as one of them, they would too. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the campfires crackled to life, Lina joined Daniel on the porch of his cabin. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the camp winding down around them. "You've given me a place," she said suddenly, her voice soft. "I didn't expect that." Daniel glanced at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. You earned it. You're not what Voker said you were, Lina. You're more than that. Her glowing eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or mistrust in them. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. You're welcome. The days in the camp fell into a steady rhythm. Lina was no longer a shadow lurking in the corners. She had become part of the pulse of the colony. She worked tirelessly, her sharp mind and steady hands earning the miners' respect. There was a quiet dignity in how she carried herself, even as she learned to adapt to a world so different from the one she'd known. For Daniel, it was strange how quickly he'd gotten used to having her around. She had a way of softening the edges of the camp, her calm presence bringing a balance to the rugged, chaotic lives of the workers. The woman who had once flinched at every sound now moved among them with quiet confidence. It was on one of these ordinary days, during a rare break, that Daniel found her sitting by the edge of the camp, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted with hues of orange and gold. She looked lost in thought, her glowing eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Lina glanced up, her expression unreadable, but she nodded. It's your camp. Daniel settled onto the rock beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. For a moment, they sat in silence. The only sounds the soft rustle of wind and the distant hum of the machinery. Does it ever feel too open here? Lina asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Open. She nodded, gesturing toward the sky. Your world, it's so vast. It feels like it could swallow me whole. Daniel tilted his head, considering her words. I guess it is compared to where you're from. Lina's lips pressed into a thin line. Where I'm from, there were walls. Everywhere. They called them structures of civilization, but really, they were cages. Voker made sure of that. Daniel frowned. You mean he kept you trapped? She glanced at him, her expression tight. Not just me. All of us. The women, the workers, anyone who didn't serve his purpose. He built his empire on control. Freedom was an illusion. He let her words hang in the air, unsure of how to respond. Lina rarely spoke about her past, and when she did, it was with a carefully measured tone, as if revealing too much would make her vulnerable again. You don't have to talk about it, Daniel said after a while. Not if it's too hard. She shook her head. No, it's better to say it. Better to let it out. Lina drew a slow breath, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. I didn't even have a name until I came here. He called me Unit 49. Can you imagine that? Being stripped of something so basic, so human, or whatever I am. Daniel clenched his fists, anger flaring in his chest. That's not right. No one should be treated like that. A small, bitter smile curved her lips. And yet it happens more often than you'd think. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, searching for the right thing to say. He wasn't good with words, not in situations like this, but he felt like he had to say something. Well, he started, his voice steady, you're not just a number anymore. You're Lina, and you're part of this camp now. We're not perfect, but we don't treat people like tools to be used up and thrown away. Her glowing eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw a hint of warmth there. Thank you, Daniel. I don't think I've ever heard words like that before. He gave her a small, crooked smile. Get used to it. You're stuck with us now. Over the next few weeks, Lina and Daniel grew closer. It wasn't intentional, just a natural consequence of spending time together. They shared meals, worked side by side on repairs, and sometimes sat quietly by the campfire, exchanging stories about their vastly different worlds. Daniel found himself looking forward to those moments. Lina had a sharp wit and a way of seeing things he never would have considered. She pointed out the beauty in the little things, the way the light caught the quartz in the ore, the sound of the wind whistling through the machinery, the simple satisfaction of a job well done. For Lina, Daniel's steady presence was something she hadn't realized she needed. He wasn't loud or overbearing. He just listened. He didn't pry into her past or push her to talk. but he was always there when she needed him. One night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel handed her a battered harmonica. "Used to play this when I was a kid," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Haven't touched it in years, though." Lina turned the instrument over in her hands, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" "It's a harmonica," he explained. "You blow into it, and it makes music. Here, let me show you." He took the harmonica and played a simple tune, the sound rough but soothing. Lina watched him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Your world is so strange," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. Daniel chuckled. "Takes one to know one." Lina tilted her head, a spark of humor in her glowing eyes. "Fair enough." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lina felt something stir in her chest. It was fragile and unfamiliar, but it was there, a small, growing sense of belonging. And for now, that was enough. The morning began like any other. The camp buzzed with activity as the miners prepared for another day of backbreaking labor. Lina was already awake, helping in the tool shed, her sharp hands making quick work of sorting and repairing equipment. Daniel caught sight of her as he passed by and gave her a quick wave, which she returned with a small nod. She had changed so much in the months since she'd first arrived, though the wariness in her eyes hadn't fully faded. Daniel had come to respect her deeply, not just for her skill, but for her quiet resilience. She never complained, never faltered, even when the long days seemed to stretch endlessly. That was why it hit so hard when she collapsed. It happened just before midday. Lina was in the middle of organizing spare parts when her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table, but her grip slipped and she crumpled to the ground. The sound of the crash brought Daniel running. "Lina," he shouted, skidding to his knees beside her. Her skin, normally a vibrant purple, had paled, and her breathing was shallow. He gently shook her shoulder. "Lina, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a dazed expression. I'm fine," she murmured, though her voice was weak. "Like hell you are," Daniel muttered, scooping her into his arms. "You're going to see the medic." The camp medic, a gruff but kind woman named Mara, examined Lina with care. She frowned as she checked her vitals, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. "Is it serious?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with worry. Mara didn't answer immediately. She finished her examination and then straightened, her expression unreadable. "She's not dying, if that's what you're asking." "Then what's wrong?" Lina asked softly, sitting up on the exam table. Mara hesitated before answering. "You're pregnant." The word hung in the air like a bombshell. Daniel blinked, sure he'd misheard. Lina stared at Mara, her glowing eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not possible," Lina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Voker told me. He told me I couldn't." "Well, he was wrong," Mara replied bluntly. "You're definitely pregnant. And by the looks of it, you've been for a couple of months now." Lina's hands trembled as she pressed them to her abdomen. Her expression was a storm of emotions: confusion, fear, disbelief. "How?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Lina, it's okay. We'll figure this out." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Daniel, I don't understand. Voker said I was barren. He used it to humiliate me, to remind me how worthless I was. How could this happen?" Daniel's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Sounds like he lied to keep you under his thumb. But this isn't about him anymore. This is about you and your choice." Lina's breath hitched, and she looked back down at her hands. "My choice," she echoed, as if the concept was foreign to her. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. At first, the miners didn't know what to make of it. The idea of an alien woman carrying a child, potentially a hybrid, was something none of them had ever considered. But Daniel's firm stance left no room for debate. Lina was part of the camp, and anyone who disrespected her would answer to him. Despite their initial shock, most of the workers rallied around her. They built a larger living space for her, one with thicker walls to keep out the harsh winds. The women in the camp brought her food and blankets, and even the gruffest of the miners began greeting her with a nod of respect. For Lina, it was overwhelming. She wasn't used to being cared for, let alone supported by a community. One evening, as she sat in her new quarters, Daniel stopped by with a tray of food. "How are you holding up?" he asked, setting the tray on the table. She managed a faint smile. "Better, I think. Everyone's been kind. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't have to," Daniel said firmly. "You've done more for this camp than you realize. And this kid? It's going to change things, Lina. Maybe not just here, but everywhere." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people are going to see that it's possible for our species to connect, to create something new. That scares people like Voker, but it gives the rest of us hope." Lina's eyes softened. "Hope," she murmured. "That's something I'm still getting used to." Daniel chuckled. "You're not the only one." As the weeks went by, Lina began to adjust to the idea of motherhood. She spent her days helping where she could, though the miners insisted she take it easy. At night, she and Daniel often talked about the future, what the child might look like, what kind of world they wanted to build for it. But as much as Lina tried to focus on the present, a nagging fear lingered in the back of her mind. Voker was out there, and if he found out she was pregnant, he wouldn't just let her go. That thought kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling as her hand rested protectively over her growing belly. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She would do whatever it took to protect her child. It started with a vibration, low and steady, barely noticeable at first. Lina stood in the middle of the camp, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she inspected a crate of supplies. The faint hum in the air made her pause. She tilted her head, her glowing eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. The vibration grew stronger, the ground beneath her feet trembling. Around her, the miners stopped what they were doing, their chatter falling silent as they followed her gaze. Then they saw it, a black speck in the sky, growing larger by the second. Daniel came sprinting from the far side of the camp, his face pale. "Everyone inside!" "Now!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Lina's heart raced as she gripped the edge of the crate. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's him." The ship was unmistakable, a jagged, monstrous vessel that seemed to absorb the sunlight. It cast a long, ominous shadow over the camp as it descended, landing with a deafening roar. Dust and debris swirled in the air, forcing Lina to shield her face. When the engines powered down, the ramp lowered with a sharp hiss. Voker emerged, flanked by two hulking guards. His spiked armor gleamed in the harsh sunlight, and his glowing yellow eyes scanned the camp with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. "Where is she?" he bellowed, his voice reverberating like a thunderclap. "Where is Lina?" Daniel stepped forward, his jaw set. He placed himself squarely between Voker and the camp. "You're not welcome here, Voker. Turn around and leave." Voker's laughter was cold and guttural. "You think you can deny me, human? Lina belongs to me. I've come to reclaim what is mine." "She's not yours," Daniel shot back, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Not anymore. She's free." Voker's eyes flicked to Lina, who stood several paces behind Daniel. His expression darkened as he took in the swell of her belly. "So it's true," he snarled. "You're carrying a child." Lina's hands instinctively moved to her stomach, her fear giving way to a spark of defiance. "I am," she said, her voice strong despite the quaver underneath. "But this child isn't yours. And neither am I." Voker's lips curled into a sneer. "You dare defy me? After everything I gave you, everything I allowed you to be." "You gave me nothing," Lina spat, stepping forward. Her voice grew louder, more resolute. "You took everything from me, my name, my freedom, my dignity. But you couldn't take my will, and you'll never take this child." The guards moved to advance, but Daniel raised a hand, signaling the miners who had gathered nearby. They stepped forward, armed with makeshift weapons, tools, metal pipes, anything they could find. Their stance was clear. They weren't backing down. Voker's gaze swept over the scene, his sneer deepening. "This is foolishness," he growled. "You're nothing but insects compared to me. I could crush you all without lifting a finger." "Maybe," Daniel replied, gripping the wrench in his hand tightly. "But you'll have to go through us first." For a moment, the air was heavy with tension, the camp deathly silent except for the faint whir of Voker's ship. Then, with a flick of his hand, Voker signaled his guards. They surged forward, their massive frames barreling toward the miners. The camp erupted into chaos. The guards were stronger and faster than any human, but the miners fought with sheer determination. Metal clanged against armor, and shouts echoed across the camp as Daniel led the charge. Lioness stayed back, her heart pounding as she watched the battle unfold. She wanted to fight, to protect the people who had become her family, but she couldn't risk the life growing inside her. Voker, meanwhile, remained still, his eyes fixed on her. "You can end this," he said, his voice calm but menacing. "Come with me, and I'll spare them." Lioness straightened, her gaze fierce. "No," she said firmly. "You'll have to kill me first." Voker's expression twisted into rage. He strode toward her, but before he could reach her, Daniel intercepted him. The two men clashed, Daniel swinging his wrench with all his strength. Voker deflected the blow easily, his spiked gauntlet knocking Daniel to the ground. "You're a fool," Voker growled, looming over him. "Do you really think you can protect her?" Daniel spat blood onto the dirt and grinned. "Not just me." From behind, one of the miners tackled Voker, sending him stumbling forward. It was enough of a distraction for Daniel to scramble to his feet, his wrench coming down hard on the alien's exposed shoulder. Voker roared in pain, but he didn't falter. As the fight continued, Lina's mind raced. She couldn't let this end in bloodshed. Not for her. She spotted a small panel on the side of Voker's ship, a control system she recognized from her time under his rule. Taking a deep breath, she sprinted toward it, her hands trembling as she worked to override the system. The code was buried deep in her memory, but she forced herself to remember. Finally, the panel beeped, and the ship's engines roared to life. Voker turned just as the ramp began to retract. "What are you doing?" he bellowed. "Sending you back where you came from," Lina shouted. She hit another button, and the ship's automated systems kicked in, locking Voker and his guards outside. The miners let out a collective cheer as the ship lifted off, Voker's curses drowned out by the roar of the engines. He glared at Lina, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I will return." Lina stood tall, her breath heavy but steady. "You can try," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you'll find I'm not so easy to break." As the ship disappeared into the sky, Daniel limped over to her, a hand pressed to his bruised side. "Remind me never to underestimate you," he said with a crooked grin. Lina allowed herself a small smile, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "I'm not fighting for me anymore," she said softly. "I'm fighting for us." And for the first time, she truly believed they could win. The camp was eerily quiet after Voker's departure, but the tension lingered, thick and oppressive. The miners worked in hushed tones, casting wary glances at the sky as though expecting the massive ship to return at any moment. Lina couldn't shake the feeling either. Even as she helped prepare the evening meal or sat with the women of the camp, her thoughts circled back to Voker's final words. "This isn't over." Daniel, too, was uneasy. He tried to hide it, keeping himself busy repairing equipment and checking the camp's defenses, but Linus saw through the facade. He spent his nights poring over schematics, tinkering with makeshift weapons, and planning for the worst. "Daniel," she said one evening, approaching him as he worked under the glow of a dim lantern. "You can't keep this up. You need rest." He looked up, grease streaking his hands and face, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I can't risk it, Lina. If Voker comes back, and we both know he will, we need to be ready." "You can't protect everyone if you collapse," she countered, her voice firm but soft. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We'll be ready, but we'll fight smarter, not harder." Daniel sighed, leaning back against the workbench. "You're right," he admitted, though it clearly pained him to do so. "But I can't help feeling like it's not enough." "It's enough," Lina assured him. "We're enough." 3 days later, the warning came. One of the miners spotted the familiar shadow blotting out the horizon as Voker's ship descended once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 smaller vessels accompanied the behemoth, their sleek designs built for speed and intimidation. The camp erupted into chaos as the miners scrambled to arm themselves. Makeshift barricades were thrown up, weapons distributed, and families ushered into the underground storage rooms for safety. Lina, despite Daniel's protests, refused to hide. "I'm not running," she said firmly, her glowing eyes blazing with determination. "This fight is as much mine as it is yours." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the steel in her gaze. "Fine," he relented, handing her a blaster. "Stay close to me." The ships landed with a deafening roar, the ground shaking as the ramps extended. Voker stepped out first, flanked by a small army of armored guards. His eyes locked onto Lina immediately, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "So predictable," he sneered, hiding behind these humans, clinging to their pitiful scraps of resistance. "It's pathetic." Lina stepped forward, ignoring Daniel's warning hand on her arm. "Better to stand with them than live another moment under your rule," she retorted, her voice clear and strong. Voker's grin faded, replaced by cold fury. "Enough talk," he snapped, motioning to his guards. "Take her. Kill the rest." The battle erupted with a ferocity that shook the camp. Voker's guards charged, their heavy armor absorbing the miners' initial attacks. But the humans fought back with sheer grit and ingenuity, using traps and makeshift explosives to even the odds. The air filled with the deafening sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the occasional explosion. Daniel was in the thick of it, leading the miners with a mix of strategy and brute force. Lina stayed by his side, her movements fluid and precise as she fired at the advancing guards. Every shot she took was aimed with purpose, her years of survival under Voker's rule making her an effective fighter. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. Despite their best efforts, the miners were being pushed back toward the center of the camp. Voker advanced through the chaos, his eyes locked on Lina, his cruel grin returning. "You can't win," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is the price of defiance, Lina. You could have spared them." Lina raised her blaster, her hands steady despite the tremble in her heart. "They're not dying for me. They're fighting for themselves, for something you'll never understand." Voker laughed, a low, guttural sound. "And what's that? Hope? Love? Pathetic." As he spoke, he lunged forward, faster than she expected. His gauntlet caught her weapon, sending it skidding across the dirt. Before she could react, his massive hand closed around her wrist, dragging her close. "You think you've escaped me?" he hissed, his voice venomous. "You're mine, Lina. You'll always be mine." "Not anymore," she spat, her free hand snapping to the knife Daniel had given her. With a burst of strength, she drove it into the joint of his armor. Voker roared in pain, releasing her as he staggered back. Daniel appeared at her side, his wrench swinging in a wide arc that connected with Voker's head. The alien stumbled but didn't fall, his eyes blazing with fury. "This ends now," Voker bellowed, summoning his guards to regroup. But before they could move, a massive explosion rocked the camp. One of the miners had detonated a trap near Voker's ship, crippling its engines. The tide shifted. The guards hesitated, their leader's ship now a smoldering wreck. Sensing the opportunity, the miners rallied, pushing back with renewed vigor. Voker snarled, his gaze darting between the humans and his crippled forces. "This isn't over," he growled, retreating toward one of the smaller ships. "You'll regret this, Lina. You'll regret defying me." She didn't answer, her blaster back in hand, aimed squarely at him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and then he was gone, disappearing into the remaining vessel as it took off into the sky. The camp was silent in the aftermath, save for the crackling of fires and the groans of the injured. Lina stood amidst the wreckage, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline faded. Daniel approached her, his face bruised but relieved. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "He's gone. For now." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "He'll think twice before coming back. And if he does, we'll be ready." Lina looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. This isn't just about him anymore. This is about us, about building something he can't destroy. Daniel smiled, tired but proud. We'll do it. Together. And for the first time in her life, Lina believed it. The camp was never the same after the battle. The scars of the fight lingered in every corner. Scorch marks on the walls, shattered tools, and a crater where Voker's guards had fallen to the miners' traps. But more than the physical damage, the camp had changed in spirit. The miners, once focused solely on survival, now carried themselves with a quiet pride. They had faced a foe far stronger than themselves and emerged victorious. They had protected one of their own, and in doing so, they had found a purpose beyond mining the earth. Lina stood at the edge of the camp, her hand resting on her growing belly as she gazed out at the horizon. The sky was a brilliant expanse of blue, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air felt lighter, freer than it ever had before. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to look over her shoulder. Thinking about running away? Daniel's familiar voice broke the silence. She turned to see him approaching, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face splitting into a grin. His bruises from the battle had faded, though he still walked with a slight limp. Not this time, Lina replied, a soft smile tugging at her lips. I was just thinking. Dangerous habit, he teased, stopping beside her. She chuckled, the sound light and genuine. It's strange, isn't it? For so long, I didn't think about the future. It was always just surviving the next day, the next moment. And now you've got a whole future ahead of you, Daniel finished for her. His gaze flicked to her belly. Both of you. Lina nodded, her hand tightening over her abdomen. The child's movements had grown stronger in recent weeks, a constant reminder of the new life she was bringing into the world. I still can't believe it sometimes, she admitted, that something good could come from all of this. Good's all around you, Daniel said, motioning to the camp behind them. It's in the people who fought for you, the ones who helped rebuild, the ones who are still here standing with you. Lina's eyes softened. And you've been good to me from the start, even when you didn't have to be. Daniel scratched the back of his neck, his face flushing slightly. Well, somebody had to. You were a mess when you got here. She laughed, a genuine burst of joy that made his heart ache in the best way. Thanks for that, Daniel, she said, wiping at her eyes. Really, in the months that followed, life in the camp took on a new rhythm. The miners repaired what they could and built anew where they couldn't. Daniel and a few others worked on improving the camp's defenses, just in case Voker ever returned. But as time passed and the horizon remained empty, the sense of impending danger slowly began to fade. Lina found herself growing closer to the people in the camp. The women taught her how to cook human meals, laughing as she wrinkled her nose at some of the more pungent spices. The men treated her with a respect she'd never known, deferring to her sharp mind when it came to fixing equipment. And then there was Daniel, always nearby, always steady. One crisp morning, Lina woke with a sharp, unmistakable pain. Her breath caught, and her hand flew to her belly. The time had come. Daniel was by her side in an instant, his usual calm demeanor replaced with frantic energy. Okay, don't panic, he said, clearly panicking himself. I mean, you're not panicking, so I won't panic, Mara. Someone get Mara. The camp sprang into action, the miners dropping everything to help. Mara arrived moments later, her sleeves rolled up and her expression no nonsense. Let's get her inside, she barked, shooing Daniel out of the way. You'll just get in the way. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort, but Lina's determination never wavered. When the first cries of her child filled the room, a wave of emotion swept over her. She stared down at the tiny, glowing infant in her arms, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't known was possible. Mara cleaned up and stepped aside, nodding to Daniel, who hovered nervously outside the door. He entered cautiously, his eyes wide with wonder as they fell on Lina and the baby. She's beautiful, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lina looked up at him, her own eyes glistening with tears. She is, isn't she? The baby's skin was a soft, pale lavender, her tiny hands curling and uncurling as she fussed. Her eyes, though closed, glimmered faintly with the same inner light as her mother's. She was a perfect blend of two worlds, proof that something extraordinary could come from even the darkest of beginnings. Daniel sat beside Lina, his rough hands gentle as he brushed a finger over the baby's tiny hand. "Have you thought of a name?" Lina hesitated, then smiled. "Amara," she said. "It means hope in my language." Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "Amara," he repeated. "It's perfect." The camp gathered that evening to celebrate the new life among them. Fires crackled, laughter echoed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air was filled with joy. Lina sat by the largest fire, Amara cradled in her arms, Daniel at her side. As the flames danced and the stars began to appear, Lina looked around at the people who had become her family. She thought of all they had endured together, all they had overcome. For so long, her life had been defined by fear and survival. But now it was defined by something far greater: freedom, family, love. And as she held her daughter close, Lina knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a number. She was Lina, a mother, a fighter, and a survivor. And this was only the beginning.